Unmute. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's Game Anglia Network talk. With us is Iuliu, who is a senior level designer. Iuliu, hello and welcome. And thank you for
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Iuliu, tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background, and what are you doing at the moment?
Wait, 1 second. Right, I'm a senior level designer. Right now, I'm working for Machine Games, but I have been working with Ubisoft Bucharest for the last 12 years. Um, I've been doing level design for 6 years, and I worked on franchises like Watch Dogs and Assassin's Creed,
And
and other unannounced titles.
all of the unannounced titles, yeah, or heavily delayed titles in a lot of the cases. Tell us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today. So when we originally chatted, as we usually do with everybody who joins the Game Anglia Network talks, from people from Finland to people from the UK to people from Bright Games all the way on the other side of the world in the US. The idea is that we have this community of people who's interested in game development, and most of them are students, and they want to learn about something. So that's when I reach out to you.
Right, so the topic of today's conversation is developing a level design visual language inside the game world. And the purpose of this presentation slash discussion is to try to understand why it's super important to have a very clear visual depiction of what we're trying to do when we're trying to prototype levels or trying to draw them. In order to do this, we need to understand some core principles about um, player psychology, human psychology. How do people uh, perceive space? How do they perceive images? And how do they use this kind of information in order to actually formulate plans and try uh, to solve problems that we laid out for them inside the game spaces that we're building. So I'm going to share some of my screen now. Um, right. So as you all of you guys probably know, the way we see the game images on from our screen into our brain uh, happens happens by through human perception. The eye converts the light and it turns it into a bunch of information things, and then it goes into the brain, and the brain turns it into what we actually think we see on the screen. This is something that it's also being used in video games, and the same way you perceive things on the screen in 2D, it's the same way you perceive things using your vision. This is called perception. And uh, we try to express composition and silhouette in lining inside video game environments in such a way that we can actually help players understand what the game's about, what are the mechanics of the game, what are the vistas, where are things placed inside the game world. If we take a look at this picture here, do we get a clear idea of what this space is supposed to be about? Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, just go a bit slower. If you go back to the previous slide, here, zoom out a bit. So yeah, so the idea is that this is the perception in terms of the physics behind it. I'm just waiting for a couple of artifacts to disappear from the streaming. So this goes back into the idea of looking at a 2D screen but perceiving all of the 3D things in it.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it's about that perception, but
okay,
it's more generalistic than that. It's about the fact that we this is how we're seeing things on the screen. This is why they think they seem to be real when in fact they're just 2D images.
mm-hmm. And
Right?
now if we go to the other image, okay. Cool. So here, if we just talk a bit about each of the things that stand out, right? That's what you're going to do.
Yes. So, um, by using clever composition, silhouette, and lighting, we can actually express the things that we want to express inside the level in ways that the people can actually understand it. This is why we always have like foregrounds and backgrounds inside a general space. And the way we actually arrange things inside the space dictates what they're going to be used for, what's their general function. Um, and if it's done properly, then there's not going to be any discussion and nobody's going to challenge the level design. But if it's done super poorly, it's going to become really hard to actually uh, accept what you're seeing as being real or at least plausible. Does this make sense to you? It's super simple.
Yeah, it all makes sense. I mean, here you can can we talk a bit about each of them then? So with looking at the composition, you can see all of the roads that are going straight towards the Golden Gate Bridge, right? And it's like, oh my God, this is San Francisco. But then you see other things as well, like all of the details, like the people and the cars, and that tells you quite a bit about what the game or what that level is about.
Well, the entire point is that you would take a look at this and you would actually understand what each of these sections stands for. For example, we might have these little houses here. What can we do with these houses? Can you go through them? Can you climb on them? Is there a path behind them? Do they sort of tie into this space? Can you use it as a gameplay space? Uh, are these spaces down here usable? Are there any paths that would lead up here? Um, where do all of these things converge? Oh, there's something over here. There's a compound, maybe there's a fence, maybe there's some sorts of stuff. So it becomes more of an explorative state of mind where the player can actually take a look at all this information and try to formulate a plan based on the things that he gets. And then you also get large silhouettes like um, background images, landmarks, locations where you might actually want to go. And all of these things are super important because in, they help create a mental model for the player. And this is going to help him actually identify um, where he is inside the world, where he would like to go, how he could get there, and so on and so forth. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you mean when you say so? Just looking a bit at the vocabulary, I think it's pretty important to go through them. So the when you say silhouette and when you say accents and fillers, what are those?
Um, Okay, so a silhouette is something that you can see with the corner of your eye. For example, if you're not looking at something specifically, it might still pop out in your field of view somewhere on the edge of your screen. If you can actually identify it as being an actual object, then the silhouette is good and you can actually use it as a point of reference, right? Um, Accents represent things that are specifically put in the scene in order for you to see them and to attract your attention. Okay? While fillers are everything that's in between that's supposed to not capture your attention. For example, all these rocks and grass and stuff that are placed here, they're simply there so you can just take a glance at them and move on, move towards the more important things. So if we look at this picture, we can actually say that, yeah, uh, the accents will be obviously on the bridge because it's over here, but
Mm-hmm.
it's also over here, and it's also these buildings here. And the fillers is everything in between that's not usable, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, all of this magical interpretation of things is based on pattern recognition, mostly because people, humans, do this very well, and they tend to actually see things in the environment that they can actually attribute a particular function or a particular, how should I put this, a particular purpose that they might have inside the environment. And this is one of the main reasons why in early games people not necessarily in early games, but for example, um, this is how QA guys would find a lot of bugs, specifically because they would actually try to see something interesting in the level that's not supposed to be there. They would go there and they would break it because it was not part of the golden path through the level. One example.
So what's the golden path in a level?
Right, the golden path is the intended path that the player is supposed to take through the level in order to reach the finish.
Okay.
Okay. Um, right. So one of the tools that we use to actually try to identify where all these things are is the rule of thirds, and we use the rule of thirds as a for composition frame in order to make sure that in each frame, in each placement, always have things positioned on a grid. If you look at this picture here, you're going to notice that this is just a photograph, obviously, but the dog and the ice flow there, they're sort of aligned, but there's nothing in the middle, mostly because all the important bits inside this frame should happen on the intersections of these lines. And this is something that is used a lot in video games, specifically when you're trying to actually build places that can need to inform you on where the cover is placed, where the landmarks are, um, where are you supposed to go, where you shouldn't go, and stuff like that. And it's also used in a lot of other things. For example, how is the player positioned on screen? If you look at this picture, you're gonna notice that in third-person games, for example, the character is always placed to the side and never in the middle because it looks odd if it's in the middle. And also, you get like a larger field of view if you have it like this, at least to the right. Does this make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm saying?
It does, and I think here it's important to recognize that the top image, the division one,
Yeah.
is a screenshot. So that's something that has been purposefully created by someone for marketing purposes to kind of like describe the game itself. And then the bottom image, the Gears of War one, that's from the actual game itself. So. Yeah, it's really interesting to look both at how you can do this when you're live within a game and you want to communicate some information to the player, but also how you can communicate a mood and the feeling of the game to the player in a press situation.
Yeah. Right. Um,
I guess one of the main questions, and let me know if we're going to go into this in a second, and I'm just trying to jump ahead here, is how you create this from the quote unquote level designer point of view. Because when you'd be developing a level both for the division and I'm guessing for God of War as well, for God of War, but also for Gears of War, you wouldn't have this player point of view until you would actually press play. So how do you go into designing a level with these things in mind, with, for example, the rule of thirds?
well, the rule of thirds obviously applies on a first-person view, right? But it's not necessarily the way you're supposed to design your level. But you can
Mm-hmm.
design your level in such a way that this also gets sort of represented within this this kind of frame. For example, if I'm going to make a small drawing here, if this is the frame that we're talking about, right? And the player
Yeah,
is looking in this direction like this.
yeah. So is this top down?
Yeah, this is top down. So the player is looking in this direction. So if we try to associate this sort of scenario to this picture over here, we could actually consider that this line is actually the frame itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in order to actually do this properly and to make sure that everything makes sense, we need to consider the fact that everything is supposed to be built on a very, very specific set of grids, right? So if the player is looking this way, we can actually assume that this is a grid and we can draw it and give it like a little nudge. And here we go. This is the grid. Now, what's the level? What is the level supposed to be like? Well, in this particular scenario, it's sort of a courtyard, right? We can interpret this as being a courtyard, but since the direction of the player is to go from here to here, we can actually make it a bit of a longer courtyard, right?
Okay, so that's because the player needs to traverse it, and we want them to
He
traverse.
needs to traverse it, but at the same time, uh, if, if the corridor itself is longer, it's going to imprint a feeling of movement onto the player, right? So when you're going to look at this sort of scenario from this perspective, one second, from this perspective, you're going to actually notice that it's longer rather than narrower. I mean, it's actually longer and it's not a square room. It sort of imprints direction. The player feels like he's supposed to go in that direction.
But
And
that's
then you
also
can
because they can see they need to get to the other side of the courtyard. So if you go back to the screenshot, you can see exactly where the exit point is, which I feel is quite important. Always seeing your goal, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's not it because it's not just that because otherwise you would just have a long corridor towards the exit. You also need to accommodate everything else in the space, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So if you would actually mark the entrances somehow like this and like this, and we would actually take these things and unite them. Union. One second. Let's move this down. We can actually define now what else is going on in the level, right? So if we draw a bunch of lines on the side to mark the actual side pieces in this particular corridor, we can actually break these things down and define that, okay, so we have a clear corridor here where the player is supposed to go, but we can actually build additional auxiliary spaces on the side that can be used for cover. So when the player actually traverses through this space, he is going to see everything that's supposed to be seen in that particular diagram, but his path is going to be something like this, right?
And that's the golden path as designed by the level designer, not necessarily as the
Exactly.
player would see it.
This is what the level designer wants, and you build a space like this, and it should work in theory, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so Um, another method that we can use to actually make sure that the player makes a distinction between elements that are important in a scene and elements that are not important in the scene is called contrast. We can define contrast based on lighting, also on color, and also on form and shape. For example, while these things here may be a bit cosmetic because they're based on actual art, just like this chest in the division in Destiny that's actually yellow and it stands out from the black background. Uh, for example, in Assassin's Creed, you have actual landmarks that are contrasting to the rest of the composition. So when the player actually goes inside this area, he would go through a frame like that and he would know that this is placed here. And if you would go to this, you try to use the actual grid, and we expand it, we're gonna notice that it's supposed to frame the shore, the sky, and the important bits of the composition, right? So everything here is visible. This is visible because it's a lot bigger and it contrasts to the rest of locations that are lower. Another example of contrast would be again in Assassin's Creed. There's a huge difference between paths and grasslands, which is supposed to actually delineate where the settlements are. And just there's from a visual standpoint, you can actually take a look at and understand that this is a road. Guys may walk through here, or this is a forest, this is a grass area. It's part of an implicit space that's outside of the location somehow. Um,
So
most of
those are
the
all different types of contrast.
yeah. Um, All these things should, in theory, be very simple to understand. Most people probably know about them, but they also lead into more abstract and concrete concepts, like, for example, leading lines, which sort of leads to some more interesting subjects. For example, the way we use leading lines inside levels to lead the player's eyes through the corridors, or the way the streets are designed in order to actually help you navigate them from one end to another. And the fact that lines going up sort of tell you that you should go up. Lines going down should tell you that you should go down, and stuff like that. It's simple things that trigger an effect inside your brain. They tell you that, hey, it might be interesting if you did that, right? The eye simply follows the line somehow. This is a subject that's been overly discussed on Twitter, and people are starting to get sick of it. But I think it's still important to consider it. For
Well,
example, yes.
well, it's also a subject that's been discussed ever since people started painting and drawing. Like if you take a classical fine art class, this is also what you'd be discussing, like looking at paintings and seeing how leading lines lead you to that, ever since perspective was kind of like developed in drawing. So yeah.
Yeah, right. Um, with the use of leading lines, we can actually go and start discussing more in-depth concepts. We can combine this with the concept of positive and negative space and go into form void relationships, which actually it's an architectural concept. Uh, but using these kinds of elements, we can actually dictate how the spacers are going to look inside the game world, for example. And we'll know that if we're doing this in a very simple blockout phase, we're going to be able to delineate where are the streets, where are the sidewalks, where are the paths that the players are going to use, and implicitly, where are the actual buildings that fill up this world, right? Where are the housing blocks? Where are the locations that the players will inhabit? This simply because at the very core basis of all sorts of design, the visual design in terms of architectural or interior design, there are just two types of spaces that are primary. You have transitional spaces, and then you have spaces that are the dwelling spaces. Transitional spaces are supposed to be considered the roads, and dwelling spaces are places where players or people go to do their thing. This is where I sleep, this is where I eat, this is where I go to shoot bad guys, right? So if you try to actually differentiate between them concretely instead of just building things in a way that's more, I just want to build a block out, then you can actually go towards building environments that are more consistent, more cohesive. They make more sense from a construction standpoint, and the players can actually take a quick look at them and actually articulate some sort of strategies or ideas about what exactly is this space, what could it be used for. For example, I did these diagrams a while ago, but if they're using very basic shapes and guidelines, but they're sort of giving you this feeling that this might actually be a street block somehow, right? You can actually have a bunch of courtyards in the back here that could be used for something, right? And this turns into sort of a collaborative process because everyone can actually collaborate in pitching ideas about what could this be used for.
With this, where did you start when you so where or where do you start when you do this? Do you start with the lines or do you start with the shapes?
I start with the lines. Or sometimes most of the time start with the lines, but then you can actually start with some really concrete concepts like what does this what should there be here, what should there be over there, and just throwing them around. I'm gonna get through this process as we go through this
Okay,
presentation.
cool.
um there are actually a bunch of psychological rules that apply um, to how you compose spaces. This is a very simple diagram. Yeah, the core idea is that if you're standing against the wall, your tendency is to move alongside of the wall or away from the wall. While if you're stuck inside two walls, you might want to move away from them, so up or down based on where you are. Mostly because people don't like to be uh, cornered, right? So you don't want to be cornered. You're trying to move away from the corner. If there's no corner, you're going to try to move away from the wall. This is the way you should think about how spaces are composed at some point. We also have a concept called implied spaces, which means that you can actually define spaces in the world not necessarily by building walls around them, but simply implying them using composition rules and by the way you're placing your props and your covers around the level. Uh, this helps tell story and it makes things look more narrative rather than gameplay driven, right? So you can have your own cover placement somewhere in the level, but at the same time, the player can associate that to some sort of thematic. Designer does this very well. It has a lot of embedded the implied spaces inside the levels that function not just as cover spaces, but also as things that people living in those houses might use them for. Maybe this is a coffee table. No, maybe this is a place where they have tea in the late afternoon, right? Maybe this is where they work, right? But geometrically speaking, they're just covers. But from the way they're actually arranged inside the level, they have this tendency of telling a story, right?
So what's that top image? That looks intriguing.
Um, this is an installation. It's supposed to give you the impression that the spaces there's no actual spaces there, right? There's just a bunch of shapes, but when they're composed together, they give you this feeling of volume, even if there's no volume there, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look along these lines, you're gonna see that there's this bit here, this bit here, this bit here. It sort of gives you this impression that there could be a cube fitting in there, or maybe there's a solid, maybe you can build worlds around here, but it's just an implied space, it's not an actual space. The thing with implied spaces is that players will uh, try to use them and will take notice of them and try to um, differentiate particular areas in the level based on that. Um, okay, one example would be shadow spaces, for example. If you have, um, do I have a picture of this? No, I don't have a picture of this. Okay, well, a shadow space is when you have a light shown inside the room, it's going to create some natural shadows inside the room,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But if you look at those shadows, people might actually be able to hide in those shadows, right? So it's not an actual different space from the space you're in at that moment, but it can be used as such simply because it serves a different function. And the point of implied spaces is that it gives you this impression that it's it's sort of breaking out the space inside the level in more of a visual way rather than an actual physical way.
Yeah, and to a degree, that's also how a lot of top-down stealth games do their level design. When you have that little cone of vision, and then everything else is in the shadows, but it might be broken up periodically
Yeah,
by the flashlights of the enemies or something like that.
exactly. Because in a stealth game, for example, it gives a feeling of empowerment simply because you're controlling the space outside of their field of vision. But if you're going into their field of vision, they're going to see you. So you have to sort of juggle these things without actually having to go from room to room, right? You can be in the same room with an enemy and play mind tricks with him because you're in the shadow and he's in the light, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Right. So, other pros- other concepts are the concept of prospect and refuge space. The prospect space is supposed to be a large area that sort of invites danger. So the player would actually go through these areas and he would feel uneasy because a lot of bad things can happen. Here's a picture of an actual refuge on top of a mountain. And here's a picture of two other refuges on top of the mountain. This is how it should be interpreted. Prospect space is a large, dangerous area. If you go and you play games like God of War or Darksiders, you're gonna notice that the boss encounters in those games are usually placed inside large arenas, mostly because they want to build tension around the boss fight and at the same time give you space to actually tackle that boss fight. But at the same time, since you don't know what's gonna happen there, you have this feeling of anticipation, like something's gonna happen, right? If you put like a refuge point inside the prospect space, that sort of becomes the, the landmark, I should say, the point of interest, like this bridge or these things over here, where the player is going to automatically try to go towards, right? If you place a lot of them, you can actually go into a situation when you're going to have like a sort of mental network between those locations because the player is going to want to be in the refuge spaces rather than the prospect. And if we try to look at it from a molecular standpoint, this is how it would look like. Prospect space is big, you can associate it to an open world. The player would want, however, to move from that open world into the places that are more safe. Uh, and those things can be represented in many, many, many ways. If we take this diagram and we try to turn it into a level, you're going to notice that we have the refuges on each side, and there are actual paths that lead here. This could be paths that the players will want to take, and the designer is going to try to make those things appealing, and you can actually punctuate them with different types of encounters on the way, just to make sure that that sort of progression isn't boring, right? uh,
So that could be anything from Far Cry to, as you were saying, God of War or Assassin's Creed, right?
can be absolutely anything. It's as generalistic as it can be. So if you try to actually draw them properly, you would have a bunch of lines. But if you turn those lines into guidelines, as we were discussing earlier, you can notice that there's some sort of structural form going on. You can actually start building things on the side of the road, and it sort of looks like there might be a settlement in the middle of the map where the biggest intersection or where the intersection happens, right here, right? And by actually and people might actually settle there. They could build their houses. There could be backyards here. There could be a lot of things going on. But once you look at this, you kind of start getting an idea of what your level might be, and you're just starting from this kind of a situation here, right?
So in that drawing, in the left one, the one with a lot of houses or a lot of buildings,
Yeah.
why are those also part of the prospect space and not part of the refuge space? Or is that
Yeah,
basically just you're trying to show
this
how?
is to are to show how you can actually connect and build places around it. This is why this next one is a lot cleaner. We've taken
Right,
out
right.
all the habitable spaces out of the prospect space, and what you get is wildlands, forest, mountain, things that you can actually traverse, but you also have some clear paths going through the middle. And if you try to get rid of them, you're still going to have some really easy to understand paths that the player might actually take. This is how you actually build levels in uh, very heavy dense locations like forests and jungles and stuff like that, right? You're still going to define um, you're still going to define some sort of paths between the forest, between the trees, and between those other elements inside the forest. But the idea is that you want to actually uh, make sure the player sees them, right? And you do that using guidelines, as we were discussing in this example over here, right? But the biggest problem with this kind of approach at this point is the fact that we don't actually have a scale reference from it, right? It could be anything. This is why it's super important, and when if you're going to take this approach, you actually need to be really, really familiar with your metrics. And the metrics are actually the scale of the player versus the scale of the environment, plus all the other things that the player can do and the measurements that you need to actually take into account uh, when you're designing your levels. For example, a player inside a virtual world is more or less around 1.8 meters in height, right?
Yeah.
And 1 by 1 meters in width, because that's how big his bounding box is. If you want to put a cover in, an optimal cover is always 1 by 1 meters, mostly because if the player crouches to hide behind the box, his bounding box is going to be reduced to that size. So it's optimal that he does that. But also, there are other dimensions that can be taken into account. For example, a typical wall in a video game is 4 meters tall, but you might actually have 3 meter tall walls that the player can jump over, right? Maybe because that's how they're coded inside. That's how the mechanic works inside the game. You need a 3 meter wall in order to jump over it, right? But
Well,
if you know these dimensions and you try to actually mix and match all this information together, you're going to get to a point where, like, right, so I have a 4 meter wall here and I can jump. How about if I put a box that's 1 by 1 and I actually create my affordable climbing space above it, right? This is something that, for example, Watch Dogs does because it sort of allows you to play around with mobile objects like vehicles in order to climb on houses or on other structures that can be climbable. Uh, but it does this by actually making these things affordable, making these things concrete inside the game world. So uh, they're they're always the same everywhere you go, right?
and it's also, sorry.
They're consistent. That's what I'm trying to say. That they're consistent, and the player interprets them as being consistent everywhere he goes.
It's also worth mentioning here that the numbers themselves and the scales are usually up to to the designers themselves, and they need to be documented properly. And you also need to experiment with various things. So, for example, if a player can climb a 3 meter wall, you should, but can't climb a 4 meter wall, you should definitely make all of your walls be multiples of 3 meters and 4 meters, because then if you make a wall that's like 3.1 meters tall, the player can easily get the perception that they can climb that, but they can't, and they get frustrated.
Exactly. This is why if you play some of the multiplayer games out there, you're gonna notice that the metric consistency is there inside the multiplayer map. Once you try to apply it to the exterior of the map, sometimes you might encounter a wall that might be 3 meters tall, but you can climb it, and it sort of breaks immersion because it sort of puts the player into a state when he's like questioning the logic of the world. Why can I jump through here and not through there? Because visually there's no difference between them, right? But in a game like Watch Dogs, for example, where everything's built on the same scale, there's no questionable debate on can I climb this or can I climb that. You can either climb a wall or you cannot climb a wall, but the difference between them is always going to be visible to the player. There's always going to be a distinction between a 4 meter wall and a 3 meter wall, even if it's just in terms of size and scale, right? And using
Mhm.
this kinds of measurements, we can go forward and start building a metrics library. And this is something that we should do on every game that we're working on, simply because it sort of simplifies the process of building things and it sort of keeps the scale together. So you can actually use this to build something like this, and you would look at it and you'd instantly understand what the scale of it is, how tall the building's supposed to be, where the covers are, where the enemies are placed, and so on and so forth, without having to spend too much time in trying to develop the scale of the location just by building bits by bits individually, right? Which is something that I seen people have struggled with in the last few months.
What's the program that all of this is on? Is that SketchUp?
It's a SketchUp, yes.
Okay, so that's like a free to download, free to use program that was acquired by Google at some point, and that is really, really useful in level design because it's also used in architecture.
Uh, it's useful to me in level design. I can't swear by what other people are using. I think it's a very useful tool. Yeah,
Okay.
right. Um, and but the main point of building an actual metrics library based on all the information that we discussed previously is not necessarily that you own a metrics library as much as you understand how sort of information can be delivered to the player. Uh, if we look at this model here that I made, um, you're going to notice that it's super easy to read. You can actually articulate your own strategies of how you might actually approach this location from various angles, simply because follows a set of rules that are standard, right? They're not they're not in your face. They don't tell you what to do, but they allow you to actually interpret them in a way that you can actually make suppositions of, like, I could jump this wall over here. I could climb on this box over here and maybe get up here, right? So um, it's super important to actually develop mindset where you can actually see how the affordable space can be conveyed inside a 3D space for others people to understand it without necessarily playing the level themselves, right?
I
Because this is obviously not playable in any extent of the imagination. It looks like it, but it's just a 3D model.
I think here it's very important to go back to something that we were discussing before we went live, and that's things like level design tests. So in this case, you have your main panorama vista picture of your level here, the one that we're looking at the moment, and then you've gone on and you've went, if you go to the images above, you've gone on and you've went into describing how that level could be traversed as a pitch, as you were saying, like, oh, the player could do this or the player could do that. And if we go back to the case that we were talking about that you were talking about earlier with Watchdogs, in this case you could as a level designer who's taking a test and you want to, for example, work on this game, you could actually go into the mechanics of the game and say, well, you could use a car to go here and shoot this guy or tase this guy, and you could easily show a non-violent path or a non-lethal path. You could easily show like a path using one of the gadgets that you have available in the game, or a violent path. And from the affordances that you've created yourself within the level, to traverse it and to get to the goal of the level, that's really how you get noticed, by being able to think, to think through multiple paths that the player might be able to take, not just the one golden path, right?
Yeah, well, I also think that it's super important to mention the fact that this is a lot cheaper to do than to actually prototype a level inside, let's say, Unreal Editor, and take a lot of time in scripting those moments and uh, getting lost in the details of actually building a game level. When in fact you can actually try to define all the things that you want to put in the level ahead of time and deliver them in a form that it's not particularly doesn't actually require anyone to play the level, but they can understand how it works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a method that's very game agnostic, because, like I said before, if you do your research and try to actually uh, understand what the metrics for the games that you are trying to make levels for are, and you can do this in the comfort of your own home without having to be employed and actually have information about that, by actually playing the game and measuring things and trying to make approximations of how tall would this wall be, uh, how tall would this player be, will it work if I build it like this, right? And it sort of gives you this feeling of, I can do this a lot faster than just like trying to slowly grind at an idea that I have.
And
Right.
it's also, when you say game agnostic, it's also to a degree game type agnostic, as long as you have some of the basic mechanics in place. Like this method could be used for a first person shooter. This method could be used for a racing game, right? In terms of defining your metrics, understanding how those metrics are being affected by the game mechanics themselves and by what the player can do, and then just working on to create a level in that type of game, right?
Yes. All right. Um, okay. So the final stage is more inducive and to how to actually use the guidelines in order to generate the layouts that you want to build in 3D later in a way that's more cohesive and it's more easily understood. This is an example that I found on Twitter about someone they were trying to build an apartment or something in Unreal Engine, and uh, the way you start fixing these things is by actually drawing the guidelines correctly and trying to make sure that uh, you're sort of getting the idea of what they're trying to do. This is sort of a one-on-one direction of what he was trying to do here. But at the same time, what you're trying to do is to make sure that there's circularity. So there's a lot of connectivity between these points. And then you go forth and you try to define where the entrances are. You add these guidelines in order to define where the implicit spaces may be. And once you've done that, you're going to have something that looks like this, right? Where you have the paths very well defined, the interiors here, the black spots, they're the implied spaces, and then you can go and use uh, your composition skills to actually break those shapes down and try to define the implicit spaces and what they might infer. Actually, try to, if you can, open up new paths through the level, start to build new things. And when you look at this, it sort of looks like a real apartment, but at the same time, does it serve the gameplay purpose that you want? It might. It might, and it's also very easy to do. And this can be applied to a large variety of types of layouts. This is for example, I don't know what it could be. What do you think, Chris, could be? Could this be a museum?
I would say, yeah, a museum, any large building, like even a university or something like that, it could work, or a campus.
Exactly. So basically, I didn't give it a purpose, but Chris gave it a purpose here. So it could be a campus, it could be a museum, it could be uh, a hotel, it could be a lot of things. But the point is because we're using composition rules and we're using guidelines and we're using the rules of thirds and we're trying to actually compose the space in such a way that actually makes sense from a realistic standpoint as well as gameplay. We're we're managing to actually incorporate the gameplay that we want, and we're building stuff that artists are going to love and they're going to love you because there's a notoriously struggle between artists and level designers because of the lack of actual cohesiveness between the design, the level design, and our art thing. But using this, you can actually get rid of those problems, and you can actually build things in such a way that it sort of makes sense from both visual standpoint and from a gameplay standpoint, and it doesn't affect your design at all.
And what I think is really interesting, looking at your apartment example, is if you go to the last shot of the apartment, this doesn't necessarily need to be, the Kingpin's apartment in a Daredevil game. It can also be like a large apartment in a Dishonored game, or something like a senator's house or dwelling in an Assassin's Creed game. So for you as the level designer, it seems to me that it's important to define the spaces and the purpose of the spaces, and then leave it to the artist to actually create the details and put all of that storytelling that you're talking about in it.
Yes, because the usually how this happens is that you would actually build the block out for the level and then you would hand it out to an artist, and the artist would actually take the level and click the block out, look at it, and sometimes they would say no, we can't do anything with this, right? because
Yeah, yeah.
their job is mostly to also to make it look pretty, but there's also to try to justify the space in a way that you, the player, would might actually look at it and say, "Oh yeah, that totally makes sense," right? Because if you look at differences between level design for older video games like Quake and level design for newer games, you're gonna notice that the old ones they have this tendency of being very abstract, right? And they have these spaces that might not hold up under observation, under review. If you from a realistic standpoint, they don't actually serve a narrative purpose, right? People don't actually use them for anything besides, oh, it looks cool and you can have a fight here. But with the modern design paradigms, you kind of have uh, to make sure that that doesn't happen and the space actually makes sense from a visual standpoint, because otherwise you're going to take this and you're going to put it into context of a realistic game, and the players are going to go there and they're going to be like, no, this, I don't believe this is unbelievable, it's not real, right?
Yeah, this
And what,
doesn't make sense.
yeah, it doesn't make sense. You want to make things that actually make sense, right? I mean, if you look at all the apartment buildings and all the apartments in the division, for example, uh, when you're working through the open world, all of them they serve this purpose of actually uh, making you want to explore them, right? They're kind of telling you, oh, you should go in there and look around, and you're going there and you find the stories that are there only also by through uh, the visual storytelling that goes on in there, but also the entire layout is built in such a way that it also actually looks like a place where things have happened, right? And so you sort of have to build them in a way that's also architecturally correct, but also supports the gameplay.
And
And needs to be a fine blend between those two.
and also you need to build something that's up to 2020 standards, like 2020, the year that we're in, as opposed to trying and build something necessarily that could have worked, in a game that was made in 1997 or something like that. Because especially when you're looking at, in our case, a job or designing a game, you're working against other people who may be contemporary level designers, and you're working for people in terms of the players who are used to today's standards and today's stereotypes, is the first word that comes to mind. Like, as you were saying earlier, if I see a wall and I was able to climb that wall 5,000 times in this game so far, I will expect to be able to climb it a 5,001 time, not be able to climb it because, oh, that's the difficult wall. But I'm not gonna tell the players that because I want to feel clever as a level designer. I feel a lot of the times we need to remember that we're making games for players, not just for the level designers.
Right. Yeah, because mm, level design should actually be invisible to the naked eye. You shouldn't actually spot the level design drops. You should just enjoy the game, right? Unless you're really trying to figure out what's going on there from a design standpoint. But as a player, you shouldn't actually be able to see those things happening in front of you, right? You should actually just move around and feel like, oh, this looks like a real place
Yeah.
that also supports the gameplay that I'm playing right now, right?
Hmm.
Right. It also supports the stat paths that I'm going through at this moment. It also supports the gunfight areas that I'm going through and the fights that I'm going through as well, right? Um, I got another example here, and that's gonna be it. Um, this is an actually very good way of actually designing things for bigger things, not just necessarily levels or apartments or just black buildings. It's also a good way of designing open world places. For example, this is how I would approach designing a city. We would go by drawing out the main paths. By using simple shapes, we can actually block out the things that are happening they're not happening. They're the houses that are sort of delimiting the roads, and we can do this and clean it up step by step to a point where we can actually define the corners and the intersection as ways in ways that are they're sort of give you this impression that these things have more importance than the things that are happening behind them, right? If you take this and you move it to a different stage and you try to actually define everything a lot better, you're going to end up with a structure that looks a lot similar with what we were doing up previously, like this. But in fact, what we're having is a selection of large roads that have been defined, and then we have like smaller roads that we're defining, and then in between them we have structures that can be interpreted as housing blocks, right? And we can do this in ways that simply just allows the player to imagine himself traveling through these streets. There's like, look, there's a house over here, and maybe there's a courtyard over here, and this is a road that takes some place, right? So it sort of gives this feeling of structure to the entire location. Um, and if you take this and you put it into 3D, it does feel like a structure, like a real place at some point, right? You just need to clean it up and try to build it as a place that, like a real level. This is an example of what it would look like after you cleaned up everything and just turn everything into proportionally correct buildings. And um, another thing that's super important at this phase, because we were talking about um, these things like this, pattern recognition, landmarks, things that you can actually see from different places inside the city or the locations that you're building. If you take this thing here and you try to actually mark every corner and make sure that it's visible from one end of the street to another, then the player is going to be able to actually generate a mental model inside his head and be like, right, so if I'm here and I'm seeing this church over here, but I'm also seeing this thing over here, then maybe when I'm here and I'm seeing this thing over here, I'm going to have I'm not going to get lost, right? Because to be honest, if you just take these things and you put it into a map and you try to walk around it, you're going to be like, it kind of everything sort of looks the same. So what you want is to try to differentiate it, but you need to do it in step. And the best way to start is like this.
Yeah,
So,
that makes sense.
in this way, you can actually look at it and you can actually give it to someone like who's not particularly adept to level design. Maybe he doesn't know level design. Maybe he is doing something else, but he sort of needs to give you approval on that. Maybe you're using for an interview. You can give something that's easily readable like this, and they can rapidly understand what's going on and make a decision and actually uh, contribute to your design, right? Because they're going to have these ideas that maybe you're not going to have at that particular moment.
Yeah, I mean, in that particular case, it's probably best to use a bit of few more patterns just so you don't have like red and green because the person you might give it to might be colorblind. But yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. This is just to represent. It could be black and white. They could be different shades of gray.
Mm-hmm. So the one thing really that I wanted to ask you, and if anybody else has any other questions, do let us know, is you're obviously an experienced level designer, and you've shown throughout this presentation that you can literally take. Give me 1 second. I need to change the scenes. You can literally take full screen. There we go. Take something like a drawing, like a doodle, and just turn it into this very elaborate level design. Um, but when you were just starting, how did things like play and having like a tool set fit into all of that? Because it seems to me, especially when you were showing those SketchUp level bits that you were able to create that really interesting level with, that you can easily start just moving things around, duplicating them, rotating them, and then at the end of maybe half an hour of play, have a level that you can then have a very rough level that you can then start to polish, as opposed to from the beginning have this grand idea in your mind that I want to create this refinery where you're going to have to kill the bad guy by throwing him in the lava.
So what's the question? Because
What's the importance of play in level design as you're just starting up?
well, it's super important because you need to be a game player. You need to be a gamer in order to actually understand what sort of gameplay you want to build, right? Uh, if you want to build if you want to be a level designer, you need to build levels. Levels are built with gameplay in them, and that's the primary reason why you're doing them, right? You're trying to give an experience to players. So yeah, it might be a bit hard at the beginning because you're obviously not going to have all the speed and reflexes and the dexterity to actually uh, articulate your designs, in a fast way. But these things come with time. I mean, you need to try to find as much information as you can. I know information is super scarce, but there are a bunch of books out there that you can actually get and read. Um, you should try to work with the tools that you feel comfortable with, and also you should actually um, try to develop your skills in a way that feels natural to you, right? Because something that might work for me might not work for you, and trying to force this sort of formulaic approach to level design might not actually apply to everyone. Maybe some people don't like to draw, or they don't know how to draw, or they just hate it altogether, right? So maybe they can find a different approach. But the point is that at the end of the day, every game is built on numbers, and if you can actually try to identify what those numbers are and try to stay consistent to those numbers, uh, it's going to give the impression of something that's more consistent than just trying to figure it out, building it block by block. And at the same time, it would be super important to actually try to look at the design part of it in perspective and try to work from a top-down perspective instead of just building things one by one, block by block.
Mm-hmm.
This means that instead of just going into the editor and start modeling BSPs or going into 3D Max and start modeling models and uh, building levels based on that and building bits of level based on previous bits of levels in a really linear fashion, the process should actually come from you thinking of the whole picture, but making it as general as possible, and then trying to see how big could this be, and just start working in smaller and smaller and smaller increments until you actually reach the detail level that you're looking for. But based on your speed of execution and your level of knowledge of the particular tools that you're using, this might take some time. But besides that, I suppose the most important thing is to not give up. Keep working on it. It's it's the thing that differentiates a guy that gets the job from a guy that doesn't get the job, right? The more you try, the more you get better at it.
And when it comes to actually prototyping things for gameplay, what so far we've mostly had to look at how to prototype things in static environments like SketchUp, like Unity. I think it was the last thing when you put the lights on that
Yeah.
environment. But if you want to actually prototype something and have people play that level, so you can actually see how they play the level, which is also really important as a level designer, what games, tools, engines would you recommend? Because you can't, like Unity is quite hard because you also need to have all of the game logic in there. But maybe you can start with the game itself and prototype the levels for that.
Uh, Absolutely. I mean, I would recommend people start doing maps inside games that have sort of development kits. I mean, Half-Life 2 does that, Left 4 Dead does that. You can actually make maps for Counter-Strike, and that's super okay. It's going to put you through the flow. You're going to see what the processes are, and actually, if you're going inside the mapping community that um, is super active, you're going to be able to compare your work with what other people's are doing, and you're going to try to get an idea of like, what am I doing wrong, right? And like, what can I improve? You might be able to get in touch with people that have been doing this for 20 years or so, and they can give you some tips on the particular tools that you're using. But I think that besides just learning the tools, you need to actually learn how to plan your things very well. Because, as one of my former teachers used to say, tools are easy to understand. Everybody's going to learn the tools eventually. It's just a matter of time. What you need to learn is the planning phase, the design bit. How do you design your things? How do you think about the core concepts behind the level? How do you articulate the gameplay in the level in such a way that's easy to understand? And since we're talking about prototyping, you have to understand the fact that in early production phases, sometimes you don't even have access to full systems that can actually give you a clear idea of what the gameplay is. So you'll have to wing it somehow. Okay, wing it is a very bad term. You have to sort of speculate on how it might work, but that just translates into a game pitch, a level pitch, an idea that you have that you then have to take and put it inside an engine and try to see how it feels increment by increment, and then just iterate on it until it fits the design that you want. Or if it's not possible, you just have to adjust your design to the realities of the technology that you're using. But again, if you're going to go for uh, development kits that are freely available and they're attached to games, that's the best way to start if you haven't done level design before. I highly encourage it. There's a lot of games that have level editors. I mean, there's if you go to world of level design.com, there's a huge list of level editors and games that you can use in order to actually go and actually try out and see if this is something that you might want to do.
Brilliant. I mean,
Also, yeah,
I had no idea that there was like a list out there being curated.
yeah, sure. Let me just find it if I want. I can give you the link.
Sure, I'll post it on the Discord.
Um, no, no problem. Should I just paste it in this chat here? Okay, okay, right. Yeah, no problem. I mean, I like talking about these things. I think it's important to actually have like um, some sort of an insight in how you
Hmm.
might be able to do some things, at least how I like to do things. But at the same time, I think it's super important that if you're trying to get into this and you're trying to actually learn how to do this, you shouldn't actually follow the guidelines that other people give you. You should be aware of the fact that there are guidelines out there, but you should actually try to see what makes you happy when you do those things and try to adjust your workflow based on that and then see if that works. And if it doesn't work, just try to do it some other way. But try to actually build your own way of doing things, right?
No, this is really useful. I think that's about it then, Julio.
Yeah, well,
Th-
thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot for joining us, and thank you everyone who's been watching. And we'll be back next month with a new Game Anglia Network talk. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Bye bye.
Bye. I'll stop streaming now.